Good evening, and welcome to the penthouse of the spiritual bungalow.
Now the
Otis. Oh,
creation took
yeah.
up the whole of each of the four elements. For the Creator compounded the world out of all the fire, and all the water, and all the air, and all the earth, leaving no part of any of them, or any power of them outside. His intention was, in the first place, that the animal should be as far as possible a perfect whole, and of perfect parts. Secondly, that it should be one, leaving no remnants out of which another such world might be created. And also that it should be free from old age and unaffected by disease. Considering that if heat and cold and other powerful forces which unite bodies surround and attack them from without when they are unprepared, they decompose them, and by bringing disease and old age upon them, make them waste away. For this cause and on these grounds he made the world one whole, having every part entire, and being therefore perfect, and not liable to old age and disease. And he gave to the world the figure which was suitable and also natural. Now to the animal, which was to comprehend all animals, that figure was suitable which comprehends within itself all other figures. Wherefore he made the world in the form of a globe, round as from a lathe, having its extremes in every direction equidistant from the center, the most perfect and the most like itself of all figures, for he considered that the like is infinitely fairer than the unlike. This he finished off, making the surface smooth all around for many reasons. In the first place, because the living being had no need of eyes, when there was nothing remaining outside him to be seen, nor of ears, when there was nothing to be heard, and there was no surrounding atmosphere to be breathed, nor would there be any use of organs by the help of which he might receive his food or get rid of that which he had already digested, since there was nothing which went from him or came into him, for there was nothing beside him. Of design he was created thus, his own waste, providing his own food, and all that he did or suffered taking place in and by himself.
So that
This
is a
is
passage
self-evident,
from
right,
Amazing. Yes.
Socrates?
Yes, naturally, of
Of
course.
course,
The world,
indeed,
of course, the
yes.
world so would eat its own waste. I mean, what else would it eat
What
by
else would
nature?
it eat? There would be nothing because it comes and returns to itself. It's a perfect sphere. This makes perfect sense. I don't
Makes
even why there
perfect
would be any
sense.
argument over this point. And as a matter of fact, in the text, there isn't an argument over this point.
So in the 19th century, a translator, Benjamin Jowett, called the Timaeus the most obscure of all the writings of Plato, the most obscure and repulsive to modern readers. And in a way, I think that's kind of fitting because, in a way, that might be the antidote to our current um, trial of trying to forge this new evangelization. Maybe we should, instead of trying to appeal to modern sensibilities the most, maybe we should give them what's the most repulsive by telling them about the world eating its own excrement. It might be more productive. Like, I mean, why not
Well,
just go the hard opposite from what I get?
well, the errors of originism aside, the what associated deeply with Plato, as we
Right? Yes. Yeah.
may or may
Makes
not
sense.
know, the one of the interesting things is that in the time of Saint Augustine, um, all the cool kids were into Epicureanism. The
Sure.
same thing, time of Cicero,
Yeah.
Epicureanism. That was the philosophy, like, and then Stoicism was, people were into that too, but it was a lot more by that time. It was a lot more like, it was a lot more like what we see now with guys like Jocko Willink or Jordan Peterson, this kind of like therapeutic neo-Stoicism. It
Yes.
wasn't really like the earth is made of fire and there will be a general cataclysm and rebirth. And here are the following hypothetical syllogisms we can use in logic. It was a little less like that and a little more like, be the best man you can be kind of thing. Marcus Aurelius and his silly meditations.
Oh, gross. He's so effete though. I don't know why these like modernist like men's men think that he's like so great.
Yeah, well, I had a professor once who remarked that the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius were the favored book of sententious individuals.
Yeah, I would say that. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, just sit there and just take it.
I like moderation.
Hmm.
Mm. But so yes, we opened with a bit from the Timaeus, which is a sort of obscure subsection of Plato's philosophy.
But it was also the most enduring work of Plato during the the greater part of the of medieval Christendom.
Three works of Plato survive into the Middle Ages in
Yeah.
Latin Christendom. The first one is the
Well, the Timaeus is the
the
Critias.
Timaeus.
Yeah.
So Chalcidius's translation survives into the Middle Ages, and two others actually come in the 11th century, and they're made by Sicilian Greeks who translating into Latin.
Okay.
Because the Sicilian, the Norman, and then later Hohenstaufen court in Sicily was trilingual. It was the aside from Byzantium at that time, it was like the golden age place for learning. It was trilingual. It was Arabic, Greek, and Latin.
Mm-hmm.
And those were the three languages that were most heavily used at the court. And as well as like the Germanic tongues and the French, but most of the business would have been conducted in those three languages. And so translation were made of the Mino, and the Phaedo.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, that makes sense.
So both of those
The Timaeus is just that's
come in,
kind of
and
the
those would have been the versions. Those would have more or less actually been the versions that Petrarch would have had access to. He didn't know any Greek.
oh wow. So all the way to Petrarch, it would have been just those Platonic dialogues.
Yeah, some of them they started to be translated at about that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The Greek the sort of expats coming over, and the before the fall of Constantinople, there was a lot of with the Council of Florence and all that stuff, and the relationship between the West and Byzantium. There were Greeks coming in to teach. Petrarch tried to learn Greek. His Greek teacher died. One of the great tragedies of his life is that he owned a copy of Homer that he couldn't read.
Oh, yeah, that would be tragic, especially for a person of the ambitions of Petrarch.
Can you imagine just why Renaissance humanist, and you have this book in Greek and you can't read it? You just look at it every day and cry.
Yeah, I can kind of imagine it. You're much
be
more of
really
a
upsetting.
linguist than me, so I'm sure you would be. There's more sort of.
But can you imagine having a book you really wished you could read, but it's just almost unintelligible to you every time you open it? You're just ah.
Yeah, I wonder if that's like a baby's experience of, wanting to read and not being able to, and just.
I think so to a certain extent, because my daughter will pick up books and just look at them, and just get agitated sometimes, and just I've had enough.
Enough.
Tease me no more.
Yeah, it's yeah, I mean, we're so lazy now. I mean, with what we have that's translated for us, it does it's you can get it in sort of everything's more accessible than ever, and it's less utilized than ever. This is kind of the opposite problem, of no access and great demand. There's tons of access and no demand. But it's yeah, it's but I don't I don't know where sort of this notion really comes from that we think that we'll be able to evangelize the the nations by sort of appealing to them. I mean, I suppose, I suppose maybe there's a pragmatism to it, like like how like the Roman policy of being able to control the people by bread and circuses. But I mean, it's not
But it's
really the
eventually
same
it's a
as
failing policy.
yeah,
It's an eventually failing policy. The degree to which public morality falls is the degree to which the empire fell apart, right?
yeah,
And that played out in real time. And the only thing that held that at bay was the accession of Christianity
yeah,
and the real the fundamental shift towards virtue.
sure, yeah,
And at that point too, under the dominance of Christianity as well, paganism takes on a different aspect in the Roman Empire and becomes a sort of sympathetic character for some of these, or a sympathetic theme for some of these, for certain historians, precisely because paganism attempts to be virtuous.
hmm.
So it kind of attempts to polish out some of the blemishes that we see in pagan culture before the advent of Christianity, and it tries to make the claim, no, we did this first, totally not imitating you now because we're scared. But
Right. Oh,
yeah,
so you're saying that?
paganism starts to look an awful lot more Christian after Christianity gets introduced, which is an interesting feature of history.
That is an interesting feature of history. But I mean, I suppose, um, hundreds of years before there was, in like post um, Periclean Athens, there was, definitely sort of um, we're talking about Plato. There's the Socratic movement towards virtue, which was sort of
Yeah, but it was,
formalized in
I mean, they
Aristotle.
killed him. They killed the man, for goodness sake.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then marginalized his disciples, and Aristotle left so that Athens did not commit another crime against philosophy. And then the same thing happens with
Yeah.
Cicero. Goodness.
Well, Cicero though was a little bit different in that he was in because he was tried for defending a tyrant, wasn't he? What was the it was there was a I remember I went through like sort of a history of Rome recently. Wasn't he sort of didn't he like lose public credibility after defending a tyrant sort of between in I can't remember like in because he was because Cicero lived in sort of that era where the emperors were changing very on a very frequent basis.
No,
Right?
no, there weren't any emperors.
Oh yeah, of course he was during the Republic. Yeah.
He
No,
was
but
during the Republic, and then
yeah,
he survived the first triumvirate. No, Cicero's position. Anthony Trollope has a very good 2-volume biography of the life of Cicero. Sure. Cicero's position never changes, but Cicero is unlike Cato in that he is a practical man, and so when Julius Caesar has absolute power,
right,
he tries to court the favor of Caesar only to see that justice is done and that the Republican traditions are preserved. So he's got a consistent position throughout his whole life. He comes in and out of public favor in his whole life.
Right.
But all the people he defends that we have his speeches for, we know that he defends them. He defends them for reasons that are in line with the general morality of his life. We know that there is no evidence that he ever took payment for any of his speeches.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a governorship in Cilicia for 1 year, and during which he did not pillage the country, so much so that he had to stop the people from erecting statues and worshiping him like a god. Seriously.
Yeah.
Because he had been so nice to them and not robbed them like all the other Roman governors had done. The sad tale of the life of Cicero is that he is the only virtuous member of the aristocracy left, and the rest of them are running
Yeah.
around pillaging Rome. Brutus and Cassius and Trebonus and Tullus, all those guys who stabbed Caesar to death, they all they wanted were their, as they would say, fish ponds and mansions.
Yeah.
Cicero was the only one who really demanded what he thought was the republic, what he thought was virtue. But he was alone, and then he said some things about Mark Antony, and then he had his head cut off and his hands cut off, and they were displayed on the rostrum in front of the Senate.
Yes, yeah. Of course, yeah. That's that brings it. It refreshes my memory.
Yeah, there are various historians who have opinions about Cicero, and I think most of them are fairly incorrect. I think that Trollope's characterization is a lot more accurate. Is that Cicero was a consistent man, but I disagree with some of Trollope's assertions about the character of Caesar, but I also disagree with many of Trollope's assertions about the character of Republican government. But
Is he a Republican?
Well, he's parliamentary democracy, sort of liberal, 19th century liberal Whig.
There's a lot of those.
Yeah, he's a good writer.
Histories, yeah. Well, the history that I listened to he was one of those sorts, but he was a good writer as well. Cyril Robinson.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So perhaps we should play the clip that has so incensed you as to drive you into these historical ramblings.
Yeah, we've been talking about kind of this new evangelization and sort of how philosophy sort of plays a role in it. And so this Trent Horn debate came up with this sort of blue-haired degenerate named Destiny that he's that he's engaged in, and it's I think it's worth watching for a little bit. It's a little bit demoralizing as well, but I can clip it here. So. I gotta put. He speaks super fast. I can't have it in double speed. That's not gonna work.
As long as all of us are humans, as long as we're all social creatures, and we've all got some agreement to live and work and exist with one another, that negative right to life ought to be protected at all stages of when a person exists.
So it's like a social contract.
Essentially, yeah.
Would a society be incorrect?
So he's defined personhood prior to this as sort of consciousness. So you don't actually have a person if there's not consciousness. So like 20 weeks basically. Testing has shown that consciousness is starting to develop.
What if I conk you over the head?
Contract included all biological human beings, so every human embryo or fetus.
When you say correct or incorrect, what do you mean by that?
Would it be a morally bad or evil contract? For example, 150 years ago, there was a social contract that said some human beings could be enslaved, for example. Throughout most of human history, social contracts have excluded certain groups of people. Were the social contracts in those societies immoral?
So immoral is kind of, in a way, begging the question of which moral system we're using. Obviously, insofar as theirs were concerned, it wasn't. Personally, I don't believe in any sort of like moral realism. I don't believe in any kind of like.
Can this stop happening in front of me?
From some objective frame of reference, this thing is absolutely morally correct, or this thing is absolutely morally incorrect. As far as I'm aware, I don't believe that we have any organs to allow us to perceive any sort of moral fact in the world. So I think that moral systems
moral
are
fact
by people.
In the world.
I think that we all have kind of shared intuitions. And so when we're writing like any kind of moral system, I think what we're doing is we're kind of leaning into the intuitions that people have, and we're trying to write rules explaining kind of why people feel the things they do. As an analogy to that, did you ever take any musical training?
Can you stop listening to this?
Yes, I
Can
was
you stop listening to this
grade,
man ramble nonsense?
I wanted to
the trumpet.
Okay.
It turns out girls like the guitar more than the trumpet. But.
True. So for music, there's something called music theory.
The trumpet, do, like Lou Bega. Come on.
Right. And say,
Lou Bega.
Good to you.
The trumpet.
Every person can do is say, well, these things tend to sound good. Let's figure out the rules for why they do and why they don't. And I believe that morality is constructed in the same way. So I'd be like probably like a non-cognitivist school of thought under like a moral anti-realism, I guess. So to go back when you asked me,
Anti-realism. What does
is
that
something like
mean?
objectively
Blah,
right or
blah,
wrong? I don't believe that there is an
blah,
objective
blah,
right or
blah,
wrong.
blah,
Just like there
blah.
isn't an objective beautiful or an objective best song or an objective anything like that. Yeah.
So like I would say it's evil to rape someone. It is wrong to do that, and it is a fact that no one should ever do that. Full stop. Would you just say?
Did he just not listen to anything?
Feel
Stop!
bad.
No, stop it! No, stop it! So, okay, so Trent Horn,
Yeah.
Mall Dad over here.
Yeah.
He just like, did he not hear anything that this guy said? This guy, like,
Just
laid
said
out
there
his
are no moral
position.
facts. Yeah.
I don't know why he's talking to him. There's no point. There's no.
Oh, I
There's no
know
dialogue
exactly.
to be
I
had
know.
here.
And it goes on for another 3 hours after this. But I didn't.
I mean,
watch the whole 3 hours.
he's just made a really like nice version of Thrasymachus.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's like a sensitive, caring version of Thrasymachus.
Yeah.
From
Yeah,
the
but
Republic of Plato.
I kind
mean,
of want to dig into Trent Horn's perspective because I think he is kind of an embodiment of kind of this new evangelization's sort of like model. So yeah, let's hear what he has to say.
It, you'd prefer people don't do that.
Yeah, that's essentially the non-cognitivist position, right? Because I don't think you can. I don't believe there's a fact.
No,
to
don't do
observe.
that.
My challenge would be
No.
is how do I observe a moral fact?
Well, I just think that we have a sense of observing morality, just like we have a sense of observing the natural world, and it's not the Matrix. We
So
have an intuitive ability to do that, and I have no reason to deny that ability to exist. That ability exists. I just as I know the world around us is real, even if I can't prove that, I know that it's an objective fact that it's wrong to rape children, for example.
So let's say that you had two people, and
What?
You're
Don't do
not
it.
arguing against him.
Yeah.
He's not arguing against his position. He's actually asserting a more vague counter position. He's
I
not.
know.
He's not even. This guy has a sort of very elaborated, sophistical position, and
Yeah.
Trent Horn is just asserting a counter position that.
Well, he's trying to
He's
trying to meet him on his own ground. He's like,
But
we
he's
don't
not
necessarily
meeting him
have
on his
to.
own ground
I
because
know.
he just said, well, I have this intuition. He's like, well, your intuitions, essentially what the gentleman with the blue hair has said is that your intuitions, since you don't have organs that perceive anything,
Moral facts.
your intuitions are not right. There's no such thing as right because there's no such thing as truth. Truth is the adequation of the thing with the intellect. And since there can be no adequation, since he clearly thinks that the intellect is a sense organ and that all sense organs interact with reality. So the only things that are real are the phenomena of sense organs. This is a not so philosophically adept recitation of phenomenology in a Kantian framework.
Well, yeah, except that
without Kantian morality.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could have a phenomenological system that has a moral framework that brackets out sort of the question of existence. That's sort of like boiled into.
Kant's epistemology does make a bunch of assumptions in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals that I think these guys aren't willing to accede to, that I think is perfectly acceptable for a lot of phenomenological thinkers.
Yeah. But anyways,
because
they came together.
Yeah.
Because phenomenology uses Kant's criticism without accepting any of Kant's constructions.
Right.
And we were observing the natural world, and two people had a disagreement over if I dropped this cup, will the cup go to the ground or not, right? Do we believe in gravity, essentially? I think that if there was a disagreement between those two people, I think that we can run tests that appeal to our faculty where we can... God damn it, Brian!
There's a motorcycle
sorry.
outside.
Sorry,
the
guys. There's
studio.
been.
We can-
Is
so-
it a leaf blower? Or
No,
I don't know
who knows?
what it
We all
is.
there's
All right.
sense data that basically we can acquire from the real world, and then it can, assuming none of us are psychotic or delusional, we can come to an agreement over whether the cup will fall or not. If two of us were to analyze a situation, we can say like the rape of kids because that's a pretty obviously wrong one for most people. But if we go into hairier situations, like say Kyle Rittenhouse defending himself, there's a disagreement there over whether or not you might have a right to kill somebody based on them attacking you. How do you observe the disagreement? Like, how do you reconcile who's right or wrong if there's a moral fact there?
Well, just like in general, let's say there are facts of history. Just because we might disagree about which historical facts are true or not, we might not have access to all the information or make inferences. We can still say that, it was a fact that the Civil War happened, for example, even if we disagree about what exactly caused it or something like that. So when it comes to morality, even if we disagree about the fact that there is disagreement about moral issues, I think that shows there's objective morality. Now, as a religious person, I do think there is ultimately
As a religious person, yeah.
universal moral lawgiver, what
Yeah.
you might call God, that ultimately explains
Might
that.
call
Even if you didn't
God.
believe in God, and there are many moral realists who don't, you could believe that. Well, the fact that we talk about abortion, we're not talking about abortion like we talk about sports teams or talk about fashion. Does this look good? Does that look good? That's very subjective. But it seems like when we talk about abortion, we can make moral progress. We can get closer to having a better position. Like, I think America has made moral progress in getting rid of slavery, giving women
The vote.
Okay, are we done with Trent Horn? Please tell me we're done with Trent Horn. He's
yeah.
a blue-haired compatriot.
Yes. We're done.
Oh, so painful. He just cedes so much ground, and then there's.
I know, it's ridiculous. I mean, it just
he cedes so much ground, and then. But then he makes these arguments
that are
going to be completely ineffective because for all I disagree with the epistemological position of the blue-haired friend here is sort of vaguely Kantian phenomenological position.
Yes.
He has taken the time to elaborate what that position is.
Yes.
And
but Trent Horn
seems to me to be committed. He seems to have committed himself to the consequences of that position.
Well, it does. And that, just to that point, like Trent Horn says, so if you believed that a person could never, like a body was never able to go into consciousness from the point that they're an embryo, could you like use them as a sex toy, basically, just their body that it will never go to, it's like, well, if it's never going to go to consciousness, sure, why not, but if that's never going to happen, so it's a pointless exercise. But it's just, but I mean, I don't understand what the point of this argument is. It's just kind of like intellectual sort of like titillation for its own sake.
Well, I understand what Trent Horn is trying to do. He's trying to just like he's trying to do what a lot of apologists I think end up doing is they just keep throwing things, just keep throwing them until hoping that something just like sticks. He's going for a rhetorical argument because what's been enunciated here is an entire philosophical argument, and so. Talking at the level, what he's hoping he's hoping is he's a better rhetorician than this guy,
right?
And so that he can convince his listeners. He's not going to convince him, obviously, but maybe he thinks he can with enough. Speaking of Cicero, right? Enough if he can do enough, maybe Cedun arma toge, right? Like he thinks he can talk his way out of what ultimately is a contest of wills with persuasive language.
Sure.
And so he's not bothering to make a philosophically sound position in opposition to what this guy is doing. What he's trying to do is he's just trying to make rhetorical arguments to either sway him or his listeners.
Right.
I don't think if any of these guys are on side with this gentleman that he's going to persuade them to abandon their position. Because I really, the rhetoric, he was not coming out rhetorically strong as far as I could tell, and that was really the only thing he was attempting to do. He was attempting to be a rhetorician, and so often apologists become rhetoricians.
Right.
And rhetoric is a valuable tool. Cicero says that without wisdom, rhetoric is downright nasty, like downright bad. It's toxic. It will destroy a state. But without rhetoric, wisdom is barely efficacious.
Sure. I mean,
and so people do have to be convinced. However, I'm not convinced that his convincing, it happens to be very convincing, because it wasn't very. If I'm going to be objective and analyze the way he was engaging in rhetoric, I don't think he was being very convincing at all, especially getting into the nitty gritty of the argument and really where. I mean, we're going back to Plato again. They're arguing at cave level.
yeah, I mean,
the puppets are doing this and this on the wall, and they're arguing about the puppet show.
well,
There's no discussion of first principles.
But why? So yeah, what is the point of sort of engaging in sort of this kind of discourse? Because that's ultimately kind of what happens when you sort of like when you have this position of sort of like the Maritain position that that we have to be, that Catholics in the temporal sphere, because he makes the distinction of the planes, like the temporal plane and the spiritual plane, and said when we act in the temporal plane, we don't act as Catholics as such, but as Catholic, and we're able to sort of like invisible leaven raise the level of discourse. And I was telling my wife about this, and she's like,
when did that
"How
ever happen?
Yeah, I know.
When did anyone in their invisible leaven raise the level of discourse? That never happened. I'm yet to see when that happens. That never happened.
And there's like, don't we need to like? My wife was like, don't we need Jesus to like show us the way? It's like, well, yeah, but I mean, you can do that invisibly. And she's just like,
what, by throwing a sheet over your head and pretending you're a ghost like my toddler? Ooh, no, that's invisible leaven. That's not how it goes.
Well, that was the whole sort of like, that was the whole rationale between sort of behind, writing the or influencing the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms in the United Nations, which Maritain was part of, and that Paul VI was, such a fan of. And this was kind of a lot of the thought behind the Second Vatican Council, as well as in being able, like in Unitatis Redintegratio, where Christians from different denominations can work together for a common humanitarian goal.
There's quite a bit of that in the apostolic constitutions,
right.
of John the 23rd around that as well. I think he was mistaken.
Well, yeah, I know, but that is kind of the whole sort of rationale behind the new evangelization as well. Like, yeah, I mean, well, not necessarily. I mean, because I don't think totally was John. That wasn't necessarily the coterminous with John Paul II's thought. Like, he thought he kind of was more in favor of some sort of Catholic sort of imbibed political action. But it was kind of
I think it's more. I think more definitely the Jacques Maritain position. But I think more what I think happened. This is my new hot take. What I think happened was John the 23rd was like, let's call forth. Like, we've got all this bad stuff that's happened. All this changes, good stuff can happen. let's call forth the champions from amongst the Catholics. And then he was just like, put out this call for champions. And it just crickets, like the bit about picking the kids for dodgeball, and the way one kid's got like one arm and the other kid's blind, and it's like, man, this, oh no.
So it was like
Not,
it was like the Hall of the Heroes, but all the heroes were just like defunct and
yeah,
disabled.
just like not well, just like not poorly prepared for what their task was to be, and there were no. It wasn't like the Renaissance, and it wasn't like the Counter-Reformation. There was no great rise of people to defend Catholicism. They were just, and those who were willing to do so, I think people like Garrigou-Lagrange, who was very specifically slotted in a position, though he's a great Thomist thinker, but by no means like a Renaissance polymath. There was no one. There was no Suarez and no Cornelius Lapide and no like, oh, it was just a disaster. It was just not even explosions. It was just like lame. It was just like, hey, and the people will rise, right? So they just like looked around.
Well, no, but they had the preparatory documents.
Some guy taking a nap in a bush.
No, but they had the preparatory documents that were, thrown out, and so it was kind of like, it was like a revolt in a sense.
Yeah, there was a revolt, but where was the gusto that fought them?
Well, yeah, I know.
Like they were kind of like, it seems
Ottaviani was
to
just
me
like,
from reading the history, Ottaviani, but he was like an 80-year-old man.
No, he's just like,
he was like one guy. He was like,
I know. He was, why do they hate me? Yeah, at the end,
he was like, he wasn't. Yeah, he was like, why do they hate me? He wasn't even like Sempronius Densus. The Plutarch talks about Sempronius Densus. So they were all going to come kill. I believe it was Emperor Galba. It was the year of the 4 emperors. And these guys weren't doing so hot. And there's this angry mob coming to kill the emperor. And all the palace guards have run away except for Sempronius Densus. There's this armed mob. And Sempronius Densus is in front of the door of the palace. And he has no reason to defend the emperor. They're not related. He's done him no favors. He's a rank and file soldier. And he pulls out his stick, the stick that you would use to hit people, like get out of here, you punk, and he would hit the drunk guy over the back of the head, and he would like go and run home, right? Like basically, it's like it's basically like a cop pulling out a taser.
I know, but it's just like,
so he pulls out this stick and he says,
but just so lame,
back off.
People would just be so like horrified by that, the idea of like hitting a drunk person on the head with a
anyway,
stick.
They were Romans, man. They were just like,
I know.
They thought crucifixion was funny. So
I know. Yeah.
He pulls out this stick.
Yeah.
And he just says, back off, disperse, return to your homes, nothing to see here. And the crowd gets closer and he says, okay, drops the stick, pulls his sword out and he says, back off. And they come at him and he goes down swinging.
Oh,
he dies before he lets this random mob come and kill the emperor.
Nice.
And he's a regular rank and file paid soldier, but he took an oath to defend the emperor, and so he's going to die defending the emperor.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Except,
but even like, why do they hate me? That's still not like Sempronius Densus. Like, you want the guy to go down.
I mean, you have to like, put your sword in your sheath, Peter. Like, I mean, you're not allowed. They have a sword, but they're not allowed to use it.
But a stick.
Yeah, that one might be.
Like Ottaviani should just pull out a stick and just hit one of the Germans in the back of the head.
Yeah, that would have been awesome.
Take you down with me.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the halls of glory and fame.
Yeah, I think that would actually been pretty good. Yeah.
Uh,
It would have been like a St. Nicholas moment.
yeah. But anyway, my point was,
Yeah.
you know, like go down fighting, but there weren't many people, I think, who rose to the occasion.
No.
That was, you know, in the immortal words of Captain Jack Sparrow, if you were looking for the opportune moment, that was it.
Yeah. It's yeah, I don't know. But it's just I don't really it's very hard though to kind of create a solution on our own. I know there's kind of like there's people who are trying to sort of resurrect um ideas of integralism, but I don't really know how we're going to really do that without any of the clergy or prelates to help us do it. I mean, it doesn't seem
Well, I think the lesson of the 20th century is that we're not on our own, and whenever we think that we're on our own and that we're required to do things on our own is when everything collapses. You know, like
Yeah.
the EU did not work out the way that that Jacques Maritain thought it was going to do.
or the UN.
And that's precisely because he thought we were going to act like invisible Catholics.
Yeah.
That was his own fault for thinking it's Pelagianism, for goodness sake.
Well, pretty much, yeah.
It's just seriously, we couldn't find, like, you know, a more cool heresy, Pelagianism. Like, where do we rank that? D? Like,
I think we did put that as like a B or something because it was there is sort of that Sigma male sort of
it's my Sigma male grind set.
yeah, sort of thing that has that appeal of it, but it is kind of lame. Yeah, I mean, it's just the model against that is sort of like the Ballad of the White Horse, you know, with by Chesterton, where King Alfred is just, he's like knocked up against this tree, and then he's about to, kind of despair of victory, but then he just takes up his axe and then fights anyways, and that's kind of where the redemption where the battle turns around, you know, and yeah.
Well, but the whole reason we
yeah.
to speak of human effort, by the way, there's no such thing as human effort that doesn't involve grace. Plato, the things that came to Plato were not merely human effort. Grace has been involved with everyone, as Eusebius of Caesarea recounts in something like the Preparatio Evangelii. He talks about how the nations were prepared for the reception of the revelation of Christ. And Plato's philosophy is one of those preparations.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess. Well, it depends on your definition of grace, right? Because St. Thomas says that, grace is built on nature. So you actually have to have like sort of be in a natural state to sort of be recipients of grace.
Yeah,
but
grace.
There's also actual grace, and then there's also because the actual grace is.
But it moves to action even when it does not sanctify.
Right. And sanctify.
And it often moves individuals to action even when it does not sanctify. And we have to trust in that aspect as well. St. Augustine, the doctor of grace, the doctor gratiae.
Yeah.
He talks about his conversion and in his confessions, and before he converted to Catholicism, he was a Manichaean, but before he was a Manichaean, he was a dissolute youth. But when he was a dissolute youth, he says, amongst these mad companions in that tender age of mine, learned I the books of eloquence, wherein my ambition was to be eminent, all out of a damnable and vainglorious end, pumped up with the delight of human glory. By the ordinary course of study, I fell upon a certain book of one Cicero, whose tongue almost every man admires, though not so his heart. This goes back to what I was talking about before, that Cicero was actually a deeply virtuous man. cuius linguam fere omnes mirantur pectus non ita. This book of his contains an exhortation to philosophy, and 'tis called Hortensius. Now this book quite altered my affection, turned my prayers to thyself, O Lord, and made me have clean other purposes and desires. All my vain hopes I henceforth slighted, and with an incredible heat of spirit I thirsted after the immortality of wisdom, and began now to rouse up myself, that I might turn again thee word. For I made not use of that book to file my tongue with, which I seemed to buy with that exhibition which my mother allowed me in that 19th year of my age, and my father being dead 2 years before. I made not use of that book, I say, to sharpen my tongue withal, nor had it persuaded me to affect the fine language in it, but the matter of it. So here, Augustine, Cicero taught Augustine to pursue the truth rather than vainglory. And what all of the arguments that Trent Horn was having with this fellow are for naught, precisely because they're talking about something that he doesn't care about. If that gentleman with the blue hair is going to change his mind, he has to be filled with the zealous desire to pursue truth. He has to grasp what truth is. His entire epistemology has to be overturned, and he has to go and search for truth. There is no discussion. If someone denies the existence of truth, there can be no discussion of the nature of truth. First, you have to persuade them to find the truth.
Yeah.
Plato's dialogues are all about persuasion, dialectic, finding the truth, not Hegelian dialectic, traditional dialectic, trying to discover the truth.
Yeah.
Those interlocutors who never discover the truth, people like Thrasymachus, they're the ones who condemn him to be killed.
Yeah.
Because for them, truth is unavailable.
Yeah.
Their arrogance becomes a good instance for others to learn the truth in the discussion. Adeimantus and Glaucon, their discussion of the Republic, they get to learn a little bit more of the wisdom, the almost divine wisdom of Socrates.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that is the way that we have to continue, is to, help people attain to that sort of the seeking of truth. But I do think that there are people. I think that that's kind of the exceptional person who's truth driven. I think that God can also. I think most people are sort of more like unity driven, like, so like people who value relationships over than everything else.
But that guy had an entire epistemology laid out. He's very clearly driven in a philosophical way.
That's true. Yeah, exactly.
So you have to be, like St. Paul says, you be all things to all people. Well, if someone isn't we're not going to like throw Plato at people who aren't into Plato.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
But we should throw Plato at people who are philosophically minded.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And here you have a clear example of him misreading what he's supposed to be doing. I think that's my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what he's trying to do, because I think he's trying to sort of have this very sort of narrow perspective of what he thinks he should do as a debater, but he's not really doing his job as a Catholic.
Winning debates is about it's an argument, it's rhetoric, it's what Augustine was learning to do before he had his conversion through Cicero, where he was learning to win arguments.
Yes, he's acting as a Catholic, but not as a Catholic as such. In this, he's following the Martinian model right here, and it's just it's pretty useless, really. I mean,
it's absurd. It's patently absurd. I mean,
And I think there's almost kind of like an immoral sort of. I mean, it's not strictly immoral. Like, I don't think that it's a sin to sort of engage in sort of these sort of hypothetical discussions, but it is kind of gross, at least. Like, it is kind of like a form of like intellectual like masturbation.
Well,
All
yeah,
you're
there's
really doing.
sophistry.
Yeah,
It's this sort of sophistry. There's no, as you saw from the debate, the one gentleman, he had an underlying epistemology, and he was trying to make clear what that was.
yeah.
And then Trent Horn was just like throwing stuff at him, like just throwing ad hoc arguments at him over and over again. And at no point was there a philosophical discussion whatsoever, which is really what needed to be happening.
Well, because he keeps kind of trying to come at these different angles. Like he says like, it's like, well, you don't need to believe in God to have
but
a.
And it's also by case example. Like people are always bringing up case examples. This, that. They're doing it to bring a mist over the discussion, to kind of make it more hazy.
Yeah.
So that it's harder. Like if you're in the woods and there's a fog, it's harder to tell if Jonathan is coming down the road or if a bear is coming down the road and I'm going to die.
Right.
But
well, he even lays out at one stage, it's really depressing. It lays out, it's like, usually what happens in these kind of discussions is I show what an absurd position like your position sort of leads to, and then he does it, and then he's like, it's a really grotesque example about him, like, with him saying that, if you have like an infant that never
yeah, you already said it. You already said it. I don't need to hear it again.
Yeah, but then like the other guy, Destiny, he comes up with another absurd example, like in sort of imitation of him, which I think was actually more funny and like less grotesque, where he says like, so do you believe that if like a woman gives birth into like a 64 cell organism, that he's like that he's obliged to like, put it in a petri dish and to like, and to keep it alive for as long as he possibly can, and like and Trent Horn is kind of like shuffling over himself because he doesn't want to seem like silly, but I thought it was actually a more clever example than Trent Horn's example.
Well, that's what you get for playing case study and not
exactly
laying out your philosophical position.
Yeah. I know. It's just, well, I don't know what Trent Horn's philosophical position is because he never is clear.
Well, that's the problem, is a lot of people don't have one. And so today's episode is brought to you by philosophy. Learn some.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And where can we find philosophy, Jonathan?
Check this out, y'all. Read a book, read a book, read a book, read a book. READABOOK.
Yes.
That's exactly.
No, and it's also a delightful thing. So last week we read poetry and we talked about poetry, and that was a very enjoyable thing. And philosophy is another very enjoyable thing.
Yeah.
And to gain that culture, to gain that deep-sighted insight and thoughtfulness, patience, so we don't have such ridiculous sounding arguments.
Yeah.
What they were doing was Plato's cave. They were arguing on the cave level, and you need to get higher. You need to get out of the cave. You need to talk about important philosophical things.
Well, yeah, I mean, you should at least call the person to step out of the cave. Like, I mean, you're not really doing your job at all if you're.
That's what Cicero did for Augustine. He summoned him out of the cave to come seek the truth.
Yeah.
Further analysis. And it's amazing what it can lead to. It can lead a pagan with no apparent access to any divine revelation, to say things like, when the Father and Creator saw the creature which he had made moving and living, the created image of the eternal gods, he rejoiced, and in his joy determined to make the copy still more like the original. And as this was eternal, he sought to make the universe eternal, so far as might be. Now the nature of ideal being was everlasting, but to bestow this attribute in its fullness upon a creature was impossible. Wherefore, he resolved to have a moving image of eternity. And when he set in order the heaven, he made this image eternal, but moving according to number, while eternity itself rests in unity, and this image we call time. For there were no days and nights and months and years before the heaven was created, but when he constructed the heaven, he created them also. They are all parts of time, and the past and future were created species of time, which we unconsciously but wrongly transfer to the eternal essence. For we say that he was, he is, he will be, but the truth that is alone is properly under. But the truth is that is alone is properly attributed to him, and that was and will be are only to be spoken of becoming in time, for they are motions. But that which is immovably the same cannot become older or younger by time, nor ever did or has become, or hereafter will be, older or younger, nor is subject at all to any of those states which affect moving and sensible things, and of which generation is the cause. These are the forms of time, which imitates eternity and revolves according to the law of number. Moreover, when we say that what has become is become, and what becomes is becoming, and that what will become is about to become, and that the non-existent is non-existent, all these are inaccurate modes of expression. But perhaps this whole subject will be more suitably discussed on some other occasion.
That really reminds me of the constellation of philosophy as well.
Yes. Well, he had that in mind. The image of the moving image of eternity.
Yeah. Boethius had the Timaeus in mind.
Yeah, and without any divine revelation, Plato, the divine revelation that we know of, Plato still talks about this. Isn't that something incredible? Isn't it incredible what? And Plato was a very virtuous man and celibate.
Yeah.
Celibate his whole life and very virtuous.
Mm-hmm.
The sort of an interesting way that his disciple Aristotle was the only one of the only happily married philosophers of history.
Yeah, well, you can say that of Socrates, since his
No. His wife was very upset with the arrangement, and Cicero's wife, when he was down on his luck, Cicero's wife robbed him.
Oh.
She got in cahoots with one of his manservants and robbed him blind.
Yeah, that's not very good.
No, but but Plato and Aristotle both very virtuous. Plato was very virtuous and celibate, and the clarity that he received, even just on the human level, is there's something there for Catholics to learn.
Well, I remember
you should learn it by reading Augustine.
I remember Augustine actually in the introduction to Christian, the introduction to Christian doctrine. Actually, he retracted the statement later, but he suggested that Plato might have met the prophet Jeremiah, which was
there's discussions and such like that in some of the Greek literature. Philo of Alexandria, I think, something like that.
Interesting, yeah.
Other Jewish apologists who were in Alexandria around the time of our Lord's life, or just before.
Yeah, well, I guess read a book and remember,
you will receive your reward in purgatory.
All right. Good night, everyone.